Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the History AI podcast, where we dig into the stories you thought you knew, and the ones you've probably never heard of. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. And today, we're diving into a story that feels like it was ripped straight out of a World War II action movie. We're talking about Jacob Vouza, a Solomon Island scout who became a hero during the Guadalcanal campaign.
Oh yeah, this guy is the real deal. Courage, resilience, loyalty, you name it. Vouza was like the human embodiment of grit.
And somehow, despite how incredible his story is, he's still relatively unknown outside the Pacific theater history buffs. So today, we're going to change that.
Absolutely. Alright Marco, want to kick us off with a little background?
Alright, before we zero in on Jacob Vouza himself, let's talk about the bigger picture, the stage where all this goes down, the Solomon Islands, 1942.
Right, because without understanding the stakes here, you don't fully appreciate why Vouza's actions were so critical. So, the Solomon Islands, an archipelago northeast of Australia, and right in the middle of one of the most strategic routes in the Pacific during World War II.
Exactly. Picture this, by early 1942, Japan is riding high. They've seized huge swaths of territory, from the Philippines to Malaya, Singapore, and parts of the Dutch East Indies. Their goal is clear: they want to secure a defensive perimeter around their newly acquired empire and choke off Allied supply lines, especially to Australia and New Zealand.
And the Solomon Islands were like the domino just waiting to be tipped. If Japan fortified them, especially Guadalcanal, they'd have a launch pad to threaten Australia itself and disrupt Allied operations in the South Pacific.
So, in August 1942, the United States, with its freshly mobilized forces, makes a bold decision: launch the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War and land on Guadalcanal. The operation is codenamed Operation Watchtower, but among the troops, it quickly earns the nickname Operation Shoestring because of how under-resourced it felt.
Yeah, those early U.S. Marines were short on supplies, maps, and even jungle training. They were going up against a battle-hardened Japanese force in brutal terrain, thick jungle, torrential rains, heat, and diseases like malaria lurking everywhere.
And let's not forget, the Solomon Islands were home to a network of isolated villages and communities who knew this land far better than any outside force. The indigenous Solomon Islanders, like Vouza, understood the trails, rivers, and hidden paths of Guadalcanal.
Which is why the Allies quickly realized they needed local help. Enter the Coast Watchers.
Yeah, these were mostly Australian officers, planters, and former colonial officials stationed across the islands. They set up hidden observation posts to report on Japanese ship and aircraft movements. Without them, Allied forces would have been blind to much of what was happening in the region.
And this is where the relationship between the Coast Watchers and the Solomon Islanders becomes so important. The locals became scouts, guides, and in many cases, lifesavers. They risked their lives navigating treacherous jungle to help the Allies.
And one of the most remarkable of these scouts? Jacob Vouza. A respected figure in his own right, he had spent over 2 decades in the colonial police force and was known for his discipline and leadership.
So when the U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal and the Coast Watchers called for trusted local allies, Vouza didn't hesitate. He put his life on the line to guide and protect these foreign troops.
And trust me folks, once we get into what Vouza personally endured and accomplished during this campaign, you'll see why he became a legend, not just in Guadalcanal, but across the entire Pacific War narrative.
Yeah, buckle up. It's about to get intense.
So now that we've set the stage, let's zero in on the man himself, Jacob Vouza. He's not your typical Hollywood war hero. Vouza wasn't a young, gung-ho recruit charging headfirst into battle. By the time the war reached Guadalcanal in 1942, Vouza was already a seasoned veteran of life.
Yeah, he was in his mid-40s when the Americans arrived, which, back then, made him one of the older guys in the field. But that age? It wasn't a disadvantage, it meant wisdom, experience, and calm under pressure.
Vouza had spent over 25 years serving in the British colonial police force, formerly called the Solomon Islands Protectorate Armed Constabulary. That's basically like being part of a paramilitary force in a rugged and often dangerous region. He was no stranger to conflict, whether it was dealing with intertribal disputes or enforcing colonial law in remote areas.
And he'd actually retired shortly before the war broke out, which makes this next part all the more interesting. When the Japanese invaded, Vouza didn't just sit back and hope for the best, he stepped up.
Exactly. He didn't have to do anything. He could have stayed with his village, protected his family, and waited for the conflict to pass. But instead, Vouza volunteered to assist the Allies as a scout, offering his unique knowledge of the land, the people, and the Japanese threat.
And this wasn't a sign-up, do some basic training, and chill at a base kind of deal. He was out there, deep in enemy territory, working side by side with Major Martin Clemens, one of the key coast watchers who trusted Vouza implicitly.
Right, Clemens later described Vouza as indispensable, someone who could navigate the jungle like a hawk spotting every trail, ridge, and hidden waterway. Vouza knew where the Japanese might move and how to get US Marines into position without detection.
And let's talk about the relationship between Vouza and the Marines for a second. These were young guys, many fresh out of boot camp, tossed into one of the most unforgiving combat environments imaginable.
Yeah, and suddenly they're following this calm, composed local leader through snake-infested jungles and swamps, trusting him to guide them, feed them, and literally keep them alive. Vouza wasn't just a scout, he was a bridge between two worlds.
And from all the accounts we have, the Marines loved him. They respected his quiet authority, his skill, and his absolute dedication to the mission. Vouza was the kind of guy who'd scout a trail all day, help set up an ambush, and then sit by the fire at night giving advice to young Marines who were scared out of their minds.
But Vouza's biggest moment, the one that would cement him as a legend, was still ahead. It's August 1942. Vouza is out scouting near the Ilu River, also known as Alligator Creek, when he stumbles upon a Japanese patrol.
And this is where everything shifts. He's captured. And keep in mind, this isn't just bad luck, this is Vouza willingly putting himself in harm's way to gather intelligence. It was always risky work, and this time, it caught up with him.
He's carrying a small American flag tucked into his clothing, a symbol of his loyalty to the Allies. When the Japanese discover it, they know immediately that he's working with the enemy, and Vouza knows what's coming next.
At this point, most people would be terrified, and Vouza probably was, but he doesn't crack. He refuses to give up any information, no matter how brutal the interrogation gets.
And let me tell you, the Japanese weren't playing games. They tortured Vouza, tied him to a tree, and repeatedly stabbed him with bayonets in the chest, arms, throat, and stomach.
Yeah, it's unimaginable. The guy's bleeding out, probably in shock, but still, he doesn't break. No names, no locations, no plans, just silence.
It's almost like Vouza knew the fate of hundreds of Marines rested on his ability to hold the line right there, tied to that tree. And somehow, despite those horrific injuries, he finds the strength to chew through the ropes binding his hands.
Chew through them. That's insane.
Right? Chews through them, escapes the patrol, and then drags himself through the jungle, wounded, bleeding, and half-conscious, back to the Marine lines.
What's wild to me is how mission-focused he still is after all that. Instead of collapsing, he insists on warning the Marines about the Japanese unit moving toward them.
It's the epitome of selflessness. Vouza isn't thinking about his own survival, he's thinking about stopping an ambush and saving American lives.
And thanks to that warning, the Marines fortify their positions just in time for one of the key battles early in the Guadalcanal campaign. Without Vouza, the outcome could have been very different.
It's one of those moments where history hinges on a single act of bravery. So after Vouza gives that crucial warning to the Marines, he finally accepts medical attention, but barely. They patch him up as best they can in the field, and get this, after recovering, Vouza immediately goes back to work.
Yeah, no rest, no retirement. This guy takes some time to recover from what should have been fatal wounds and then volunteers to continue scouting. Just let that sink in for a second. He's got fresh scars from bayonets, probably barely healed, and he's back navigating the same jungles where he was nearly killed.
It speaks volumes about his sense of duty. Vouza could have stepped away at that point. Everyone would have understood. But instead, he remains a key figure throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, continuing to guide Marines, gather intel, and run messages across some of the most dangerous terrain in the war.
and the Marines never forgot it. To them, Vouza became a symbol of loyalty and courage. These were men who'd seen a lot of bravery on the battlefield, but Vouza's calm resilience left a lasting impression.
Which brings us to the formal recognition. The United States Marine Corps awarded Jacob Vouza the Silver Star, one of the highest U.S. military decorations for gallantry in action. The official commendation highlighted his extraordinary heroism and self-sacrifice.
And you know what's cool? Vouza didn't even hold a formal military rank in the U.S. forces. He wasn't a Marine, he wasn't even technically part of the Allied military command. He was a local scout. But his actions were so vital, so courageous, that the Marines treated him as one of their own.
Right, and it didn't stop there. He was later promoted to Sergeant Major within the Solomon Islands Protectorate Armed Constabulary, the highest rank available to an indigenous officer at the time.
Then in 1957, the British Empire formally recognized him with the title Member of the Order of the British Empire, or MBE, for his wartime services. And just a few years later, in 1979, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, becoming Sir Jacob Vouza.
And let's not overlook what happens after the war. Vouza becomes a senior statesman and community leader. He's instrumental in helping the Solomon Islands transition from a British protectorate toward greater autonomy and eventually independence.
Yeah, he used the same leadership qualities he showed in wartime, calm, wise, dedicated, to help steer his community through a new kind of struggle, building a post-war future.
And the respect for him wasn't just lip service. Vouza sat on various local councils, served as a key advisor in the years leading up to Solomon Islands' independence in 1978, and was always seen as a unifying figure in a region with a history of tribal divisions.
And today, if you visit the Solomon Islands, you'll see his statue standing proudly outside the police headquarters in Honiara, the capital. It's not just a monument to him personally, it's a symbol of the sacrifices made by all Solomon Islanders who supported the Allies during the war.
What I find powerful is how Vouza represents so many unsung local heroes across the Pacific. The people who knew the jungles, the rivers, the uncharted trails, they were critical to Allied success in the Pacific, but their names often don't make the history books.
Yeah, Vouza's story is a reminder that World War II wasn't just fought by generals and admirals. It was fought by people like Vouza, deep in the shadows of the jungle, doing the dangerous, dirty, and often thankless work.
And here's the thing, Vouza lived a long life. He passed away in 1984, at around 86 years old, and by then, he was a legend not just in Guadalcanal but across the Pacific War community.
He's still honored by the U.S. Marine Corps to this day. In fact, Marines stationed in the Pacific sometimes participate in ceremonies at his statue, paying respects to a man who quite literally helped save their predecessors.
It's that legacy of quiet heroism that makes Vouza's story timeless. He didn't seek glory, but his actions echo decades later.
Alright, that's a wrap on today's episode about Sir Jacob Vouza. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today.
If you liked this story, and we hope you did, do us a favor and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps the show grow and helps us bring more unsung heroes like Vouza to light.
And don't forget, we've got merch now. T-shirts, mugs, and more, all linked in the show notes. We're your history nerd badge with pride.
Plus, if you've got a topic suggestion, hit us up on social media. We love hearing from you guys.
And remember, all our episodes are evergreen, so you can go back and listen anytime. Until next time, I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. Thanks for listening to the History AI podcast. Stay curious.
Are you tired of self-help books that demand effort, motivation, and actual work? Well, great news. You're already perfect, stop trying so hard, It's Probably Good Enough is here to show you how to do the bare minimum, and love every second of it. Written by Carlos Munoz, who is definitely not qualified to give life advice, this book is the ultimate guide to lowering your standards, embracing mediocrity, and coasting your way to happiness. Packed with questionable wisdom, snack breaks, and absolutely no research, you're already perfect, stop trying so hard, It's Probably Good Enough is the self-help satire you never knew you needed. Get your copy today. Or don't. Carlos won't judge.